Hello, my dear students. Welcome to another class of Appreciating Poetry. Today we are starting with Yehuda Amichai and his work Anniversaries of War. Yehuda Amichai is an Israeli poet. He won the Israeli Prize and he was nominated for Nobel Prize several times. He wrote in colloquial Hebrew language. And there are references of God, love, war in his poems. Let's learn more about the poet and the poem Anniversaries of War. Yehuda Amichai, winner of Israel's most coveted award, Israel Prize. He was one of the first to write in colloquial Hebrew. He was writing in Hebrew language. And he was awarded 1957 Shlonsky Prize, 1969 Brenner Prize, 1976 Bialik Prize. These are all awards related to Israel. And in 1982, he was awarded Israel Prize. He also won international poetry prizes and was nominated several times for the Nobel Prize in Literature. And coming to his biography, he was born in Germany and his German name was Ludwig Pfeiffer. But at the age of 12, he fled from Germany due to Nazi persecution. During early 1930s, Germany was in the rule of Nazi, Adolf Hitler, the totalitarian rule, and Jews were forced to flee the country. They have to face persecution, and they fled. Amichai fled, and he lived in Yemen Mosh, a place near Jerusalem. His poems have been translated into more than 37 languages. In 1955, Now and in Other Days got published. 1963, Not of This Time, Not of This Place, his only novel, was published. And the same work, Not of This Time, Not of This Place, dramatized as a play known as Bells and Trains. It was in 1967. And in the same year, his poem, Jerusalem, was published. He was also known as the Walt Whitman of Jerusalem. Walt Whitman was an American poet. In 1976 is another work, Seven Laments for the War Dead, was published. As a young man, he volunteered and fought in Second World War as a soldier in the British Army. And he also took part in other wars in Israel. See, we are going to study about Anniversaries of War. This poem contains autobiographical elements. In 1956, Amichai served in the Sinai War, that is the second Arab-Israeli war. It was a war, that invasion of Egypt by the Israel. And in 1973, he served in the Yom Kippur War. It is also known as Ramadan War or October War or 1973 Arab-Israel War. It was a war led by Egypt and Syria against Israel. His poetry. So these things you have to keep this in mind, because when we study the poem, he is remembering about the wars that he was into. So you have to remember these references too. His poetry deals with issues of day-to-day life and also with philosophical issues of meaning of life and death. MHI has been credited with a rare ability for transforming his own personal experiences into everybody's experience, his own private experience into everybody's experience, his own love situation to everybody's situation, with transforming his whole experience, and he could make his own personal experience as everybody's experience. And that's why it has been said a rare ability for transforming the personal, even private, love situation and all joy and agony into everybody's experience. Like making his own time and place a general. His work is characterized by gentle irony and imagery. What do you mean by irony? വിരോധാഭാസം. പുറത്ത് നല്ല കാറ്റും മഴയൊക്കെ ആണെങ്കിൽ നമ്മൾ പറയാം എന്ത് നല്ല കാലാവസ്ഥ എന്ന് പറയുമ്പോൾ നമ്മൾ പറയുന്നതല്ല നമ്മൾ ഉദ്ദേശിക്കുന്നത്. സെയിം വേ ഇൻ റൈറ്റിംഗ് ഓർ സ്പീക്കിംഗ് ഇറ്റ് ഇൻവോൾവ്സ് യൂസിങ് വേർഡ്സ് സോ ദാറ്റ് ഇൻറ്റൻറ്റഡ് മീനിങ് ഇസ് ജസ്റ്റ് ദി ഓപ്പോസിറ്റ് ഓഫ് ദി ലിറ്ററൽ മീനിങ്. And his work is also characterized by imagery, and like many secular Israeli poets, he struggles with religious faith. His poems have references to God and the religious experience. Remember, he fled from Germany due to Nazi persecution of Jews. He got a Jewish background, and he got references to God and religious experience in his poems too. He was described as a philosopher poet in search of a post-theological humanism. He is also known as a philosopher poet, and he was into post-theological humanism. That is, in earlier theological inquiry, was they were giving more importance to finding truth or morality and in relationship with God, and post-theological humanism, which embraces the atheistic spirit also, and they don't no longer embraces the theological concepts. And some of his imagery is found to be sacrilegious too. That is, in poetry, in his works, it could be seen that certain things which is considered to be sacred, and he was making references to destroy that sacred nature. That's why it has been said it's imagery. Certain imageries were found to be sacrilegious. In his poem, "And This Is Your Glory," for example, God is prowled under the globe like a mechanic under a car, futilely trying to repair it. It is not a good reference to God. And in the poem, God's change, prayers stay the same. God is portrayed as a tour guide or magician. This is for your reference only, I have mentioned. Amishai's work was popular in English translation, but admirers of his poetry in the original Hebrew claims that his innovative use of the language is lost in translation. He wrote in Hebrew language, but admirers of the original Hebrew poetry says that when his work was translated into English, his innovative use of the colloquial Hebrew language was lost. Subtle layers of meaning achieved using an ancient word in Hebrew rather than its modern synonym to show the biblical connotation cannot be conveyed to the readers. The layers of meaning, that means a word when it is translated to another language, its real meaning or real essence get lost. Almost every poem by Amishai is a statement about the general human condition, and Amishai, in a certain sense, is always a philosophical poet. Amichai had a girlfriend, Ruth Hanover. Annie occasionally referred his childhood friend Ruth in his poems as Little Ruth. He changed his name to Yehuda Amichai around 1946. And some say that he changed his name from the influence of as the idea of Ruth, but he later says that it was his own idea to change his name to Yehuda Amichai. The only influence that the relationship with Herman had on his poetry is on one poem, The Rustle of History's Wings, as they used to say. In that he wrote, "For 5 shillings I exchanged the exile name of my father's for a proud Hebrew name that suited hers. That whore ran off to America and married a man, a spice dealer, pepper, cinnamon, and cardamom, leaving me with my new name and with the war." Okay, I mentioned this for your reference. Amichai's poems are easily on the surface, but they got profound thoughts. I told you he's a philosophical poet. We can find the elements of humor, irony, and but his works full of passion. Secular elements can be seen, but also references to God you can see in his works, and allusions you can see in his works, and usage of metaphor you can see, and he used colloquial language in his poetry, and self deprecating humor or self criticism in a humorous way also you can see in his works. As I told you, you can see irony in his works, autobiographical elements in his work. We are going to study Anniversaries of War. You can see the autobiographical elements, and he depicted raw emotion through his poetry. Passion you can see. With a few words and images, he portrayed Holocaust, God, loss, idealism, and war images in his poetry. And his poems were written in Hebrew, colloquial Hebrew language, and his translations into English being particularly popular. And his imaginative style introduced Hebrew poetry to English poetry readers. Also, his accessible style introduced contemporary Hebrew poetry to American and English readers. The poet C.K. Williams described Amichai as the shrewdest and most solid of poetic intelligences. Poems in 1969 and selected poems of Yehuda Amichai in 1971. It was translated by Ted Hughes with other translators. Ted Hughes, the famous 20th century poet, he said that, "I've become more than ever convinced that Amichai is one of the biggest, most essential, most durable poetic voices of his past century. One of the most intimate, alive, and human, wise, humorous, true, loving, inwardly free, and resourceful, at home in every human situation. One of the real treasures." That's what Ted Hughes said about him. And his later works translated into English that includes Time, Travels of a Latter Day, Benjamin of Tudela, Yehuda Amichai, A Life in Poetry, then selected poetry of Yehuda Amichai, Exile at Home, and Open, Closed, Open. And as I already mentioned earlier, he took part in Arab-Israeli War of 1948, and he fought with Israeli defense forces. These war images or war references, you have to keep this in mind, because when we study the poem Anniversaries of War, he remembers about the war time. The rigors and horrors of his service in the Arab-Israeli conflict and in World War II can be seen in his poetry. And in an interview with the Paris Review, Amichai noted that all poetry was political. This is because real poems deal with the human response to reality. Politics is part of a reality, history in the making, he said. Real poems deal with response to reality, and politics is also part of reality. And he said all poetry was political. Robert Alter was his translator, and he says Amichai's work bears resemblance to the poetry of Auden, and he was inspired by T.S. Eliot, Auden, and Dylan Thomas, famous poets. Rilke was also inspired him, the Austro-German poet Rainer Maria Rilke. His native language was German, but he read Hebrew. At the age of 12, we know he immigrated to Palestine. He stayed near Jerusalem. After World War II, he attended the Hebrew University. And he wrote his poems in which language? He wrote his poems in Hebrew language, colloquial Hebrew language. In 1982, Amichai received the prestigious Israel Prize for Poetry for effecting a revolutionary change in poetry's language. Amichai's style is something much more complex in its native Hebrew, and he frequently exploited Hebrew's levels of diction. He wrote in Hebrew language. Reviewing the selected poetry of Yehuda Amichai, American poet, Ed Hirsch stated that Amichai is a representative man with unusual gifts who, in telling his own story, could be related to the larger story of his people. And he died in Jerusalem on September 22nd, 2000. So I hope you got an overall picture about Yehuda Amichai, so that when we move into the poem, it would be easier to understand the poem, keeping these points in your mind. So we will start with the poem in the next class. So study all these things, read more about Yehuda Amichai. Happy learning.